Yeah. Well, not very many of us, obviously. And I figured we would just have a general open-ended, unstructured discussion in any case. I didn't plan a formal presentation of any kind. I thought we have a fair bit to digest, especially after Brad was kind enough to join us last week and give us a taste of some of the examples that he's covering in his upcoming book, which I'm really pretty excited about. So that was the main thing, was just to kind of chat here and continue to mull over the things we've already been thinking about and see if there are any other interesting new directions we might go in the new year. These two slides that I've got here, and I'm happy to show those next time as well if anybody else who's not here today is interested in seeing them. These are just examples of poor technology forecasting that we tend to cite in our work, and I should probably qualify these the agencies that make these do two quite. I'm trying to find a nice way to and non-accusatory way of framing the rationale that they use to justify these sorts of projections and forecasts. Right. I think the most charitable case that I can make is on behalf of these folks is that they tend to claim that these forecasts represent a set of assumptions that that reflect current commitments that have already been demonstrated by industry, investment, and governments, and their actual methodology is not open. It's opaque. It's not transparent. We are not able to see what they're actually doing, if anything, rigorous at all when they're making these forecasts. But that's the main rationale that we see when they face criticism, and they faced it not just from us but from many others. Going back to, I think the first example of this criticism that I've seen is in 2014 in a paper by some folks at MIT. But at any rate, so these projections for solar power, which is in installed capacity worldwide, that's what the International Energy Agency's projections are in its World Energy Outlook series. They ostensibly represent what is already in the pipeline, except that there is nothing in the pipeline for 2030. If you go back to 2010, for example, or especially if you go back to the year 2000. But if you were to go back to 2010, there was no information about what was in the pipeline for the late 2020s or 2030, and so it's starkly disingenuous what they are claiming in any case. So I'm trying to be as charitable as I can, but it's difficult.
Isn't also that methodology basically presuming a steady state of something? I mean,
well, this is the thing: is it's presuming investment and.
if you've already got it planned for 2030 and that's the number you take, it's explicitly assuming nobody new will decide to do it between now and 2030, right?
Something like that, yeah. But I think it's actually worse than that, because it's not only that nothing can change, but that the ambitions from the present are very minimal. They're limited, right? So it would be one thing to make an accurate forecast of 2030 and then stick to it, or update it over time incrementally or something like that. But this isn't even, as you can see, this isn't anywhere close to the right ballpark. So it sort of has two problems. One is that it's sort of representative of a static mode of thinking that only changes incrementally rather than taking on new information. And two, that mode of thinking is clearly off. It's wrong by several orders of magnitude. So it's so I mean it's very difficult to defend. I'm trying to be charitable, but it's if I speak more candidly, this is simply inexcusable. Just methodologically, it's inexcusable. Just in terms of the scale of the errors that are here, given was already evident by 2010. So what you can't see on the scale of the y-axis here is that exponential trend was already well evident by 2010. So if you zoomed in the scale on the y-axis, it would still look exponential. The trend was already there, completely consistent in the data, and it had been for a decade by 2010, maybe even longer than that, closer to 2 decades really. Although the absolute quantity was very small in the 1990s, so you could be forgiven for not making inferences that far ahead, perhaps. But by 2010, people were already talking about this. Kurzweil had been hammering on about it for a decade or more, and people like my boss, Tony Seba, had already published books about this. And so there was really no excuse by 2010 to be continuing to make the same mistake. And yet the agency has continued to make the same mistake for another decade, up until the present. So at this point, it's really quite inexcusable.
If I had to,
at least in my opinion. So,
if I had to force you, what percentage would you attribute to motivated reasoning or something like corruption, and what is just simply the expected effect of decisions by consensus, where I don't know what the International Energy Agency is, but presumably it's a kind of consensus building body drawing committee members from many other agencies and governments and institutions.
I think it is partially, but I think it's a very large component of its governance is the energy industry itself, which compromises its documents like this in a big way, as you can imagine, right? So energy was more or less synonymous with fossil fuels, with ignoring 15 or 20% from nuclear power and hydropower. It's basically synonymous with fossil fuels for a century during the 20th century. And so you could be forgiven for having the International Energy Agency, a non-governmental independent organization, basically an independent industry organization. It can be forgiven for representing the interests of the energy industry and the outlook of the energy industry, because and to see things through the lens of fossil fuels, because it really was the energy sector really was mostly fossil fuels for a very, very long time, and up until only just recently. So in that sense, it's a little bit forgivable. Or maybe explicable probably is a better word than forgivable. It's understandable. But if you were to twist my arm, I would probably say that at this point it's not incompetence or motivated reasoning or anything methodological really. At this point, the industry, the agency has come under so much fire, so much criticism that it has to be making an active effort to fail to update its methodology and to ignore signs all around. And so I would say at this point, I mean, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, my answer would be different. But today we're almost in 2022, no sign of change from this organization. I think it has to be almost entirely motivated reasoning based on the incentives at this point. This World Energy Outlook series is, unfortunately, the agency still proclaims it to be the world's authoritative outlook and source for energy projections and forecasts. So it's I have a quote for that. I think it's still on their website. So they claim to be the world's foremost authority on this. I mean, they aren't saying, this is just what we think, take it or leave it. They're claiming to be the most authoritative source of information of this kind, and very large investments in the tens of billions of dollars made each year by governments and by other entities, and including the investments that are made on behalf of me through our pensions and so forth. on the basis of these false forecasts about the future of technology in the energy sector. So there are real consequences to this, and it's. I think at this point it's really, as I said, I think it's quite inexcusable behavior, frankly, and it probably has been for quite a while. So let me jump to the next slide and expand on why I think this is so destructive and why the consequences are so severe. This is not an innocent and consequence-free mistake that's happening here. The next slide is projections for coal in quadrillion BTUs. So that's the energy unit. This is the measure of energy generated by coal in the United States. This is from the United States Energy Information Administration. So this is part of our government. And it's widely viewed to be quite a prime example of regulatory capture, where this agency has more or less been a captive of the fossil fuel industry for quite some time now.
At least the later ones are sloping down slightly.
Yeah, slightly, right? But can you see any wishful thinking here at all?
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. Right now, here's the thing. If you own substantial amount of assets in the coal industry, or if you owned them over the last decade, and the authoritative source from the government, and certainly the industry as well, was telling you that everything was going to be fine, and in fact things were marching towards collapse, as they are, you would be losing a lot of money. What I don't have here is another very good indication of where the U.S. coal industry has headed over the last decade is the Dow Jones Industrial Coal Index. There's an index of the major coal companies that were publicly traded. The Dow Jones folks over there maintained that index for, 20 years or something like that. And they discontinued it in September of 2020, I think. And they discontinued it because the value of the index. So this is the index value of all of the stocks from, I forget how many companies were in the index at one point. It was dozens. It had fallen over 99% since 2011, I think, was the previous peak. So indexed, it was at 500 and something points, and it was under 5 when they just discontinued the reporting it because the industry had properly collapsed. So the U.S. coal industry is dead. It is in complete collapse.
Do you have an estimate for the size of the plunder here? Maybe plunder is actually a fair word. I mean, if public sector investments, so like pension funds or things that taxpayers are on the hook for, continue to invest according to these prices, while private investors are offloading these assets like mad, isn't there a case to be made that the officials in the government are essentially participating in, a plundering of Social Security and other investment sources from public taxpayer funds?
Sure. I think there's a very strong case to be made for that. We argue that our February 2021 report, we looked at the levelized cost of energy. He pointed to this specific problem, and it's not something that we are likely to pursue aggressively, but we certainly tried to shine a bit of a spotlight on this issue and encourage others to then take that forward. I think that it's pretty clearly a legitimate complaint from the perspective of ratepayers / taxpayers in the energy sector, that they are, the public are being saddled with worldwide at least $2 trillion US dollars worth of assets that are going to be worth nothing in 2030.
Do you have an opinion about
this is a scandal, certainly, and it's one that's happening all over the world.
Do you have an opinion? It occurred to me last time we had this conversation that there's some argument to be made here that there are long-term risks to privatization of state assets that are maybe not so obvious. So if you privatize energy assets, say, I mean, not only power plants, but other infrastructure to do with energy, and then you retain those assets or investments in them in return for the privatization, so the state has an investment interest in them. It's therefore, there's a perverse interest for many officials to prevent those prices from dropping, and that perverse incentive includes convincing themselves of false things, like this graph very clearly shows. Is it possible that privatization of the energy assets in many companies over the late 20th century is directly responsible for the level of stupidity that is illustrated in the oversight of public officials of these kinds of graphs that we're looking at here? I mean, they're clearly incentivized not to believe that these asset values are dropping, even though they are. And I guess the question is why.
Yeah, it's. I think that's certainly. I think that's a plausible piece of what's going on. It may vary substantially from one region to another, one market to another, one country to another. But I think it's perfectly reasonable to suppose that is a piece of what's happening. I think it's in some places, for example, in the United States, I think it's complicated by the fact that we do have a rather grotesque revolving door between government and private sector, right? So many of the individuals who serve in the appointed leadership positions of these agencies, like our Department of Energy and so forth, they will be from industry originally, and then they enter government, and then they exit government and head back into industry. And this is the so-called revolving door. And so there are corruption-inducing incentives, multiple directions, simultaneously between government and the private sector that certainly in many U.S. energy markets have served to inflate the value of these assets long past when it was obvious that they were going to suffer sort of catastrophic decline to worthlessness. This is now completely evident for coal. They're still in denial about it, about history repeating itself for natural gas in the energy sector and for gasoline and diesel in the transportation sector, which is the bulk of petroleum. Liquid petroleum products, the bulk of those by quantity, by volume, and by economic value is as fuels, and those are all going to be disrupted by the transportation disruption, as we've talked about. So that same dynamic is going to play out there. So yeah, there's no question we've got a whole set of incentives that motivate denial of what's pretty clearly on the cards, is so that these asset values on the books stay high, so that future projected cash flows stay high, and when your metaphor, right? When the chickens come home to roost, when the shit hits the fan, whatever you want to say, it'll be the taxpayers and the public that are almost certainly going to be left holding the majority of the bag, and we'll have to suffer that loss. So it's a consequential situation, right? These things are avoidable mistakes that have very large financial consequences. And they have other consequences too. I mean, the slowing down the adoption of clean energy and clean transportation has very serious and at the statistical level, measurable impacts on human health, right? So you delay change over to clean energy and clean transportation by 5 years. You're measuring the numbers of lives saved in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands in a country the size of the United States over time. So this is not inconsequential. And then the other thing is my poor, silly, boneheaded colleagues in the environmental disciplines take these forecasts seriously too. Of course, they should know better, but they don't, and they don't listen to people like me very well. We certainly haven't in the past. And so their climate projections are informed by these same energy forecasts. And in some ways, there are some perverse incentives there too, right? The climate science community has some incentive, and I don't want to make this. It's certainly not a conspiracy, but there's certainly some incentive to have some motivated reason to believe that we're in bigger trouble than we are, because it will take longer to clean up energy and transportation, food, for example, clean up these three major greenhouse gas emitting sectors of the economy. It's much easier to what's the right word, to indulge alarmism and to leverage that for various reasons. If you can point to a so-called authoritative source that says, we can't possibly make this change to clean technology, by the 2030s, it's going to take 50 to 80 years to make that change. And there's motivated reasoning in the climate science community and the environmental community as well, because they can point to these same forecasts and say, no, we have to cut consumption. We have to adopt lifestyle changes. We have to do all of these other things, some of which are ideologically motivated, not rationally motivated. And we have to do those because the energy forecasts from the authoritative sources are telling us there's no way we're going to be able to switch anytime soon. And so there's quite a bit of rotten and ill-incentivized nonsense going around, in a kind of a toxic relationship between parties that should otherwise be fairly antagonistic towards one another, but the incentives align to kind of maintain this charade a bit, I think, which is a strange situation, right? I mean, it's strange and it's not obvious, it's unintuitive, but I think it explains a fair amount of what we see.
Strange and very robust. I guess let me ask a critical question about Rethink X as an institution. So let's take for granted that many of the people responsible for this particular trend in energy, and ignoring the trend more accurately, could easily have known, but choose not to know, or know and ignore the fact. If Rethink X comes up with very compelling evidence in area after area, and even if there's a great theory that makes a very convincing case for how all these trends are linked or sort of inevitable, what is the actual mechanism of effect on the behavior of society that helps society to avoid, us poor taxpayers avoiding from footing the bill for trend after trend like this? I mean, you get the consensus to... it's... Okay, here's bluntly what I imagine the effect of Rethink X is, and you can comment. You help to shift the consensus a little bit, or accelerate the shift of consensus, so that the Overton window shifts enough that people on the trailing edge no longer can get away with just hiding in the herd, and they have to actually do something. If that's kind of accurate, you're having an effect now. It seems a very dramatic effect on the behavior of many places around the world in terms of how they treat energy policy, but in some sense it's extremely late, right? You surely accelerated this a bit, but if that's the best that one can hope to do, then, well, it's a little bit depressing. Are there any other mechanisms beyond this one, do you think? Let me just throw one out there. I've read quite a lot from Robin Hanson about prediction markets and stuff like that. There's a problem where somehow there's information that people are not paying attention to because they're incentivized otherwise inside their institutions and the other ways we organize society. Are there other ways that you can think of sort of bypassing those mechanisms that, don't work by actually trying to massage those institutions and get the people in them to behave the right way, but somehow are more accelerated forcing function on their behavior?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. This is a question that we ask ourselves constantly. We had a something of a retreat, a team retreat, in November, and this was the center of the discussion, which is, we've done our basic analyses of three major disruptions are coming, and we've outlined the broad features of that: the energy, the transportation, and the food disruption. There are others that are offing, but they're perhaps not at quite that same scale. But we can imagine there may be similar disruptions offing for healthcare, for perhaps education, for perhaps materials and manufacturing in some sense. So there may be something more coming in the information sector with different computing technologies. We've got artificial intelligence and machine learning, and we've got quantum computing and a few things that may it's not these aren't areas we're working on right now, but it's possible to imagine that there could be a few other major disruptions that are also coming. But the three that we focused on are really sort of the foundation that we've built. The work that we're going to be doing over the next few years going forward is not so much adding to that list of major disruptions, but rather looking at the three that we've already analyzed and trying to understand, okay, what are going to be the implications of just those three? Especially when you look at the three of them in combination with one another. I mean, understanding that all three of them are going to overlap. What does this affect? And the first piece of research work that we did on that was what the climate change implications might be, and that was I think a decent piece of work. But the larger question then is exactly what you asked, Dan, which is, okay, well, we've done some analysis. We've reached some surprising conclusions. We see some interesting, larger, broader implications based on those. Okay, how do we inform decision making others around the world? And our strategy initially, so for the first 3 or 4 years of our existence as an organization, and before that, a decade before that, with Tony's work, was to target a worldwide audience of about 10,000 decision makers. So these are big institutional investors, so basically major decision making individuals who are vested within large institutions that can deploy capital and make influential shifts in the course of their country or their economy or their industry and so forth. So we're talking about leaders in government, people in senior positions in government. Maybe leaders is not the right word, but certainly people in senior decision-making capacities in governments, senior decision-making capacities in large companies, and decision makers in investment. And that was that strategy for the first 3 or so years. But what we realized is that just doesn't seem to be enough. We've had some good results. I mean, we've had notable policy changes in a handful of major markets and countries, which is very, very encouraging. That have been at least partly attributed to our work, although our work, of course, as you guys know, is just part of a rising tide, and we're not the only voice in the wilderness. But I think we've done some good work, and it's had some impact. But we're not. I mean, we're trying to be realistic and see that this is just not changing things as fast as it needs to change, as fast as they need to change, and this is very frustrating. And so, one of the things that we talked about is our strategies for shifting the public consciousness around these issues at the same time as influencing the key decision makers, and sort of what's the right word? Was that flanking, pinching, having some sort of pincher maneuver where you're attacking the situation from both sides, and or from multiple sides, and sort of getting a better effect that way. And so we don't have we have not ironed out specific strategies yet. This is all still stuff that we're open to thinking about, and that we're brainstorming about, and that we're going to begin exploring over the next a year or two, we're growing the organization specifically to try to take on some of these challenges and some of these projects. But the thinking is we've got to reach the public, and we're not going to be able to do that effectively with writing a big report every 6 months or a year. We have to have a number of other different strategies to be more effective. And it's so I guess this is a very long-winded way of saying that we need a new messaging and outreach and communication strategy. In addition to carrying on and continuing to do more work, especially on the implications of the analyses that we've done already. That needs to happen. That research work still needs to happen, but we need to do more than just the work. We need to better messaging, and so there's the content of the message, the style of the message to consider, the medium, like which channels do we utilize, which partners partnerships do we form, and partners, who might they be? This is all the kind of thing that we're thinking of right now, because it really is a problem to identify a situation and see that some urgent action would really be beneficial if we could take it as at any level, and from I suppose even individual households, but certainly from the community level all the way up to the national level. We could be making much better choices than we are at the moment, and avoid some serious losses, and avoid some costly mistakes, and gain some great benefits. And if we make good choices now, it would make a big difference. But we need to figure out how to get people get the message across better. So anyway, this is now a big organizational challenge for us. It's I don't have great answers to this, and as you might imagine, it's not my expertise either. We'll see what we come up with and what works and what doesn't. But I think we're going to be trying a whole bunch of new things. I suppose I should give Tony credit where credit is due. I think for one individual who was basically just who wrote a book and then beat the drum beat out on the speaker engagement trail, he had a pretty big impact for just one person, and that was a model that was he was fairly content to continue, and then when we started dealing with COVID, and speaking engagements stopped being possible, it really made us just grind to a halt on that front and sit down and really rethink, okay, what are we doing here? Is that the right model? Should we just be doing this completely differently? Should we be making documentary films? Should we be raising funds for a Netflix series? Should we be doing a podcast? Should we be writing children's books? Should we be doing writing textbooks for high school and undergrads? What should we be doing to get this out there? We're already reaching investors. Tony is already successful in that to quite an extent in that community. So what else can we do? And so that's where a lot of our thinking is right now on that front. I mean, do you have any? Anybody have any suggestions? Anybody
have any I solved this problem.
It's a tricky nut to crack, and the one hand, it's great. It's very positive news. In some ways, it's news you would imagine everybody would love to hear, and then in other ways, it's sort of because it does run contrary to some existing established existing narratives, and it by its nature disruption not aligned with the status quo. In many ways, this is not a message that's easily communicated or easily received. So we have some real challenges there. And of course, this is all assuming that we're more correct and we are wrong, which there's no guarantee of. I mean, I think we're probably onto something here. I think we're these charts, for example, that I've shown here, they are some evidence that we're probably on a better track than the incumbent industries are. But we could be wrong about all this too. We need to be honest about that as well. So, but assuming that we're more right than wrong, it'd be great to get to change the thinking, change the zeitgeist in general, and then to really have that pressure be from the bottom up, from the public, and then from the top down, from key decision makers as well. That would be ideal. The question is just, okay, how do we do that with maximum impact and effectiveness.
I guess you have a natural, I mean, a bit like merchants with regards to democratic constitutional reforms and so on. You have a natural political constituency in those making a living or seeking to make a living out of the new paradigms in each area, right? Like, presumably, the people in precision fermentation are on board with your message and will amplify and spread it, and are happy to advocate for education around these topics in their countries and regions and so on. Is that true in each of these areas? Is there like a natural constituency who's aligned to the message, not just because they want to be correct about something, but because they're kind of skin in the game? I suppose it's also true with energy.
Oh yeah, I mean, we certainly have. There's no question that these the for example, just specific examples like the one you mentioned, the precision fermentation industry, the cellular agriculture industry. Those are sort of the two technologies. So Impossible Burger is a precision fermentation technology that makes very, very accurate simulations of animal products with plant-based ingredients and clever biology and chemistry. Cellular agriculture is the growing of animal tissue in vitro, right? Yeah, and so those two industries are, of course, massively bullish, and on our analysis, they are with no surprise, and of course, they're very busy trying to do this same thing. They have a messaging challenge very much of a sort with us, at least for the food disruption. So we have some natural, I guess you could call them allies in these new industries, the disruptors who are leading those industries. But it's surprising how little regard those new industries are given, how little traction they're given, because the incumbency really does hold sway in the public narratives and the public consciousness and mind, and then also in existing leadership, as far as we can tell, in leadership in a variety of different capacities, even in the investment community. Right? I mean, there are not that many people, that many folks who are rushing to invest in these new food technologies yet. I mean, there are some encouraging signs, and some big players are starting to get some skin in the game. Like Tyson Foods is a very large food corporation in the United States, one of the largest ones, and they've recently put a large investment in directly into some of these startups. But it's taken a surprisingly long time. We've as far along as switching gears to energy, as far along the growth curve, this adoption S curve, the disruption S curve, as solar and wind and batteries are, there hasn't been a complete divestment from fossil fuels yet. And a lot of people have made a lot of money investing in solar, but it hasn't been an exodus from the entire fossil fuel industry the way you might think. I mean, coal is taking a beating, but you would think with writing on the wall for all of it, it would be
one of the problems.
There would be more support. So
is one of the problems here that?
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking about, maybe it was one of the things you gave me. I read something about the history of the production of photovoltaic cells, and how that went backwards and forwards between, I think, Germany, Japan, and China, was it, or the US as well? And
that's in the US, but yeah.
Yeah, how just knowing the trend doesn't necessarily mean you can pick a winner to invest in, and it's maybe not trivial to invest in the sector, because when it's a startup, when it's even at this stage, maybe say with the precision fermentation, maybe if you just evenly invest in all the companies doing it, you'll probably lose a lot of money.
That's right. Yeah, it's very difficult to pick winners. Just the internet, starting in the 90s and then into the early 2000s after the first .com crash in '99, it was a very similar sort of situation. It was very hard to pick the winners that came out of that. It was not at all clear in the mid 1990s that it was going to be the winners were going to be Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, right? I mean, only two of those even existed in the internet space at that time. I mean, if you could say Apple did, but it was mostly Amazon and Microsoft, and Apple to a much lesser degree. Then of course there was no Facebook, there was no Google in the mid 1990s. Yeah, everybody knew at that point, and I would say everybody, but certainly there was a massive interest among investors to begin investing in what was quite clearly going to be a major growth opportunity. Maybe they didn't even realize quite how staggering the internet would be, but they knew there was something big happening there. But picking those winners was really hard.
So here's a thought experiment.
It's a very similar situation now. Yeah.
So here's a thought experiment. So, okay, you can't point to maybe the total invested value in precision fermentation to make an argument that it's going to disrupt everything, right? I mean, the reason the IEA can point to these figures and not look completely stupid is that, well, maybe there's not any other big number to point to that's objective, which shows that there's an anti-consensus against this position, right? So if you have these precision fermentation companies, well, if it's so clear that they're going to replace the milk industry and so on, well, why isn't everybody putting their money in it? People can ask this question, and it's maybe difficult to answer without sounding like you're kind of evading the question, right? In the way we just did.
But it's a good rhetorical post. It is, yeah.
But there's just no clear way for that capital to be allocated. But suppose there was a prediction market where you had some objective number, like the number of liters of milk produced from cows, or something else that you can kind of measure in a way that can't be gamed. And then you ask these, I mean, if there existed a prediction market for that, where people got to bet on what that number would be in 2030, and then you make a big bet on that, and then you ask the people, well, why don't you take the other side of the bet if you're so sure about your numbers? Or how sure are you actually? I mean, that kind of thing might be a way of at least exposing the lack of confidence. I mean, actually, IEA projections, or the projections of some milk company that thinks precision fermentation is nonsense, they're not actually confident predictions. It's just that nobody gets to call them on their hand, right? Because there's no market mechanism apart from investing in their challenges to show objectively that their position is as weak as it actually is. I'm just sort of I don't expect. I mean, prediction markets have their own problems, I guess. But part of the problem is that it's on the one side you have the incumbency, which is such a strong retort to any statement about like how obvious it must be that certain things are going to be the way they are in, say, 2030. That.
Yeah, and the prediction, I guess. So a couple of thoughts here, and I'm not, my investment in that and finance are I have no expertise in these domains at all. So these are just thoughts that are not really any more sophisticated than from a proper layperson. But it strikes me as one of the major issues with prediction markets for prediction of all kind, whether explicit prediction markets or implicit markets for prediction. For example, like the investors short stocks as well, which is a prediction of that the incumbency is going to the value of the incumbency is going to decline in some way, right? I think for both of those, a big problem is the time horizon, right? I mean, it's 10 years, 5 years, even less than that, even 2 or 3 years. That's such a long way out. That it's since contracts tend to be shorter than that, and it probably those prediction markets probably don't have an operative impact on the value, because they aren't able to inform decision making right away. And it's so when people are shorting a stock, I mean, maybe they're you might have a few investors who are doing that on a long-term basis. Well, I'm going to bet this company is going to be in decline within 3 years or something like that. But I think it tends to be a more short-term uh, uh, mechanism. And so I guess my point or my thinking in bringing this up is how do you get how do you operationalize longer term time horizons for and that information that comes out of forecasting those, how do you operationalize that in a way that is valuable enough right now that it can fly in the face of the incumbency and their position that you described, right? That well, if this was such a sure thing, why is anybody still invested with us, kind of thing?
Yeah, I don't know about the long term.
That's a tough nut to crack. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking of the intermediate term. I mean, think about it as the Challenger problem, right? With the NASA rocket. So all the engineers, or a large number of engineers in NASA, knew the rocket was risky, but all the managers could pretend otherwise and the politicians could pretend otherwise. Because who asks the engineer? Nobody goes down and finds random engineer in the production bay and asks them what they think. But suppose you have situations like that with energy or other trends where they're far enough along that it's sort of obvious to all the insiders, at least the ones who aren't in public-facing positions where their incentives are skewed by various things. It's obvious to a lot of insiders that, yeah, it's going to go this way, but there's at least a few years or more to go before the public understands that this is what most of the insiders really think.
Right.
There may be a way of shortening that gap, which makes use of even informal mechanisms like prediction markets, right, where you just...
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think there's a lot of... I mean, the internet's helped a lot with that, right, where you get to see the opinions of kind of insiders that aren't, like, don't pass through the gatekeepers who would otherwise prevent you from knowing that certain things sort of are the way they are. So you can, if you know how to dig on the internet, you can often figure out what's sort of going on in a field outside your own. But yeah, there remains, I guess, anyway, that's... I just had one thought on a different topic before we have to wrap up. I'm paying quite a lot of attention to, there's a very rapid series of formation of new scientific institutions, mostly in the US. One's called New Science, but there's quite a few of them, mostly around biotech, but also other areas of technology, where they're outside of the usual scientific funding systems, which have come to be, I mean, there's ridiculous statistics like I think there's more funding given to people who are over the age of 65 in some scientific domains than there is to people under the age of 40 or 35, I don't know. But if you look at the history of scientific innovation, usually it happens with people who are fairly young, but they're not who get funded anymore. So there's been a lot of thinking done recently in reaction to that, and people are starting... I mean, DeepMind is a good example of basically what is a scientific institution outside of the normal system of higher education and universities and research, but which is at the forefront of research in many areas, not just in their original area of, say, AI. I wonder if some of the work Rethink X is supposed to do is to integrate with the new institutions that are being formed, much as the Royal Society played an important role in the development of the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution. If this isn't an era of new things, and one of the ways Rethink X might leverage the formation of new things is to engage with the people who form them.
I think this is a brilliant suggestion. We in our recent team retreat, we talked about need to form partnerships of various kinds I think we were sort of intimating a little bit in the same direction, but I don't believe we explicitly discussed new scientific entities, institutions, or organizations, or entities that are starting to emerge. But that is a fantastic suggestion. Dan, maybe you and I can take it offline if you want to point me in the right direction of a couple of these that you've had your eye on. That would be great.
Yeah, well done. All right, maybe we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Great suggestion, and thank you for that.
Well, thanks again, Adam.
My pleasure, and everybody have happy holidays and happy New Year, and I hope we can pick this up and maybe with some more structured content in the new year.
Sounds good. All right.
Good. Great. Thanks, everybody.